Section 16 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6, Administration and Police, Part 2. As we have in a previous chapter enumerated the leading warriors who commanded the French armies under the administration of Richelieu, it will be better, we think, to complete the details we have given here on the civil service, and just say a few words about the two principal secretaries of state, de Noailles and Chavigny. François Soublé de Noailles began his official career as treasurer at Rouen. Named Controller General of the Finances in 1634, he became Secretary of State for War in 1636. He was at the same time superintendent of the royal palaces and keeper of Fontainebleau. He contrived to ingratiate himself with Richelieu and acquired great influence over the army. The Abbé Arnaud alludes to his roughness and his austerity. Tallemant says that he had the soul of a true valet, and that he used to mend the cardinal's walking sticks. Saint-Mars embraced him one day, and wishing to turn him into ridicule for wearing a sword, when he had scarcely the strength or courage enough to raise it, said, "There's to you, my brave fellow." Montglat informs us in his memoir that Louis XIII. Used to closet himself up with him in order to read the breviary. One word now to conclude about Chavigny. Trained by Richelieu, he was a man of considerable merit, but of still greater ambition, and the decided share he took in the cardinal's most violent measures had made him generally hated. He had as his colleague in the Council of State Giulio Mazarini, and at first the two politicians seemed to be on terms of strong friendship with one another. As they both aspired, however, to the highest rank, as they both believed that Richelieu could not have a better qualified successor than Chavigny or Mazarin, their friendship soon turned into hatred. Already, at the very time of which we are now speaking, there broke out every now and then symptoms of bitter jealousy. Thus, on the occasion of the conspiracy of Saint-Mars, the Duc de Bouillon, implicated in the plot, had, as we have previously seen, been only too glad to give up his principality of Sedan to France in order to save his life. Now it was Mazarin who had conducted the negotiation, and Chavigny was jealous at the success which the future minister had obtained. For in one of Mazarin's carnets, memorandum books, we find the following passage under the date September 20th, 1620. At Narbonne, Chavigny, after having made to me for 3 consecutive days the warmest professions of friendship and affection, went to call upon Blank, and told him that I might have dispensed with playing upon him, Chavigny, so scurvy a trick, the negotiation with the Duc de Bouillon, that I ought to be satisfied with seeing France weary of having raised to the cardinalate a monkling, en fratière, like myself. With the help of these various coadjutors, Richelieu spent most of his time in settling the affairs of the state, his chief recreation being the pursuit of literature and the composition of dramatic works which were as poor and as worthless as can possibly be imagined. We must now examine a few of the reforms he introduced into the home policy of France, and see on what grounds he incurred the hatred which pursued him relentlessly until the day of his death. We must observe, in the first place, that if the animosity he excited was so intense, it was not confined to the nobility. Of course, he aimed at destroying the power of the aristocracy, but it would be an error to believe that the reason of this was because the nobles were nobles. If he attacked their authority, he attacked quite as energetically the power of the parliaments, the influence of the provincial assemblies, the liberties of the cities, the independence of the clergy. He wanted the king alone to represent the government of the state, no intermediate between him and the nation, eis coiranas esto. Now, in the early 17th century, the most tangible sign of power was a fortress, a castle with a moat and drawbridge, garrison and governor. France was covered with these strongholds, and Richelieu saw that their destruction was a matter of absolute necessity. He accordingly obtained from Louis XIII a decree to that effect. It bears date July 31st, 1626, and was granted at the request of the deputies of Brittany. It crippled for ever the power of the aristocracy by destroying their chateaux, and it was carried out with the utmost severity on the very justifiable plea that fortresses not situated on the frontiers of the kingdom are useless for the purposes of national defence. It was only 3 days after the arrest of Chalais when the decree in question was signed, although originally local in its character, for, as we have said, it was the result of a petition presented by the Bretons. Richelieu ordered that it should be applied throughout the kingdom. The work of demolition began with the citadels of Assigny and Lamballe, and a few other towns belonging to the Duc de Vendôme, who had been one of the accomplices in the plot made by Chalais. The government of Brest was purchased back by the king from the Marquis de Sourdéac, head of the powerful house of Rieux. The Duc de Retz, in like manner, had to give up, in consideration of a large sum of money, the property of Belle-Isle. This measure met with the heartiest support of the bourgeoisie and the people, and it seemed wonderful that Richelieu should have power enough thus to level with the ground the fastnesses which for so many ages had served as a protection to some of the most notorious criminals. The governors of the provinces had been consulted as a matter of form, but the assembly of the notables was directed to draw up independently a list of all the castles and strongholds to be pulled down, and besides preparing a statement for the districts of Poitou, Saintonge, Angoumois, Provence, and Dauphiné. The meeting proposed as a general measure that all fortifications built without permission of the king in private residences for the last 30 years should be destroyed from the roof to the foundation, de fond en comble. It is an iniquitous thing, said Richelieu, to wish to set an example by punishing the humble who give no umbrage, and as we should treat the nobles well when they behave well, so we ought to keep them under discipline more than the other subjects of the realm. Let us add that the work of destruction did not take place as easily as might be imagined, for as late as 1629 Richelieu, alluding to the subject, expressed his wish that it should be soon thoroughly completed. The establishment of the intendants, or administrators of the various provinces, is another important fact which must be taken into consideration whilst enumerating the attacks made by Richelieu upon the privileges of the aristocracy. Under favour of the civil wars, the governors of the provinces, all belonging as a matter of course to the highest families in the realm, had almost universally shaken off the yoke of the royal authority. They had in their own name raised troops, assessed and collected taxes, and administered justice. In fact, they had usurped every kind of power, and became petty tyrants for the provinces they governed. They regarded their offices as a kind of hereditary property, which they were lawfully entitled to transmit to their children, and which they did not mean to give up except in exchange for dignities or pensions. When Richelieu came into office in 1624, there were no less than 19 principal governors, including personages of such consequence as the Dukes de Longueville, de Chevreuse, de Vendôme, and de Montbazon, the Prince de Condé and de Guémené. All these were, by virtue of their own position, pledged to oppose as much as they could the development of the monarchical policy, and as a matter of fact, nearly every one of them took a part more or less prominent against the cardinal. At the death of Richelieu, only 4 out of the 19 original ones remained. The rest had, with a few exceptions, found their way either to the Bastille or to the scaffold. They were replaced by the intendants, who acted as delegates from the king in all matters touching upon the administration of justice, police, and finances. The office of intendant existed before Richelieu, but he increased its powers, made it permanent, and introduced gradually several notable improvements which were completed in 1637, when the regime of intendances was uniformly applied to all the kingdom. Liable to be dismissed at pleasure, and depending absolutely on the goodwill of the minister, these responsible officers were the agents of the central power. Their business consisted in carrying out with blind obedience the decrees and edicts emanating from the king, and therefore, feeling themselves always supported by him, they did not hesitate to execute the duties with which they were entrusted. They had the delicate task of controlling the action of the governors and the local parliaments, taking care that the former should not step beyond the discharge of their military functions, and that the latter should not attempt to assume the power of independent legislators. It is obvious that in his desire to suppress all the petty tyrants who till then had kept the kingdom in a constant state of disorder and civil warfare, Richelieu had gone to the opposite extreme, and established the unity instead of the multiplicity of despotism. Nor can we be astonished at finding that the immense power given to the intendants roused the anger not only of the aristocracy, but of the local parliaments. 11 years had scarcely elapsed, and in 1648, at the commencement of the Fronde, the Parliament of Paris, for a short space of time triumphant over the crown, claimed as one of the guarantees of public freedom the suppression of the hated intendants. We are thus naturally led to examine the relations which Richelieu had with these semi-political, semi-judicial bodies, which aimed at taking permanently the place of the States General. The most important of all was, of course, the one held in Paris, and it was not likely that the cardinal minister, so resolutely opposed to the intervention of the nobility in the affairs of the state, would allow a body of legists to assume the same pretensions. It is necessary that we should, in the first place, inquire a little into the constitution of the Parliament, its duties and its privileges. The reader must not suppose that there was the slightest analogy between that body as it existed under the Ancien Regime and with the political assemblies which make the laws at the present day, or the tribunals which see that these laws are carried out. It consisted of about 150 members distributed between 8 chambers: 1. La Grande Chambre; 2. The 5 Chambres des Enquêtes; and 3. the 2 Chambres des Requêtes. Each chamber had a president, except the Grande Chambre, which had 6. The Président à Mortier, 2 advocates general, and 1 solicitor general completed the list of the members of the court. The Grande Chambre, as its name sufficiently points out, was the principal branch of the Parliament. It tried only cases of greatest importance. The beds of justice and the solemn audiences were held in its precincts. In the Chambre des Enquêtes, trials were judged from written inquiries and reports drawn up by special magistrates. The Chambre des Requêtes examined and decided as to the petitions presented to the king. The advocates general and the solicitor general were designated as the king's men, les gens du roi, but it would be an error to look upon them as the blind tools of the government. Like the councillors, they were the owners of their offices, and once appointed they could not be removed. If we consider the parliamentary hierarchy, we find a councillor in the Grande Chambre was far superior in position to a councillor aux enquêtes. A président aux enquêtes aimed at being advocate general. An advocate or solicitor general thought that the greatest piece of fortune which might happen to him was to be named président à mortier. For these magistrates, thus called for the cap, mortier, they wore, were attached to the highest of the courts. The senior president sat in Parliament as the immediate representative of the king. His attributes were nearly those of a chairman of the legislative body nowadays, named by the government. The Grande Chambre was the conservative element, whilst the Chambre des Enquêtes constituted the opposition, if we may so say, the party of progress and of liberalism. The Enquêtes, says Omer Talon, are composed partly of middle-aged persons, partly of young men, who are led about by their president. All the principle of evil in your body, said the king one day to the court, resides in certain members of the Enquêtes. End of section 16.